So I'm titling this video, Why Bibliographies Matter, or Why Professors Care So Much About Bibliographies. I decided to do a video essay about this probably because it comes up with my non-academic friends, but then also with students, as to why do professors care so much about citation styles and getting them right. And this isn't a video about citation styles per se. It's more about why they're important and why they're useful. So obviously I'm a professor, and I know I can be a real stickler for proper citation styles. But why is that? Can't I just post a URL or, a link to something or embed it and call it a day? Everything is either embedded these days or is hyperlinked. So all I have to do is click and it'll take me to the source, right? Why should I figure out, I guess is the ultimate thing, why should I figure out what's in the source beyond just that hyperlink? And why should I figure out who wrote it and who's the author and all that kind of stuff? Essentially, why should I do basic research on the source, I guess? Well, ultimately, I guess the reason I wanted to do this video is to talk about why citations are more than just receipts. It's very useful for people who have to read a lot of academic literature or have to read a lot of scholarly literature or need to know the sources of information. So basically anyone who's reading something that's not a news article, and people who are reading that literature really depend on bibliographies to convey a lot of information. And when I say people who read a lot of scholarly literature, I mean a lot of literature. I spend a considerable amount of time reading journal articles and scholarly literature, which naturally have bibliographies. Practically half of the books on my bookshelf have some form of bibliography in them. And this is true of a lot of nonfiction as well, whether you're reading a history book, even a popular history book, so something about a Civil War history or the history of the Rio Grande. I have a whole book, that thick book right there is the history of the Rio Grande, or Rio Grande, however you want to pronounce it. Sorry, my apologies on the Spanish there. But a lot of history books have bibliographies. So even if you think, oh, well, this is just something I do in college, you'll still encounter bibliographies in your life. Maybe not to the same extent as, say, a professor teaching in college, but you'll probably still encounter bibliographies nonetheless. So nobody actually reads the bibliographies per se, and that's not the point of what I'm getting at. Bibliographies are essentially big data dumps. There are massive amounts of data about data, what we would call metadata, but that's what makes them valuable. When I was a student, it was never emphasized, to me at least, the value of citations and bibliographies. I knew plagiarism was bad, and I needed to prove where I got my information from, that quote-unquote receipts aspect of things. But it's more than just protecting yourself from plagiarism. It's about information sharing. There is so much information coded into both in-text citations and bibliographies that I use practically on a daily basis to make judgment calls on the validity and utility of sources cited in a text. To explain what I mean, let's use a couple examples. So I'm going to pull an example from a bibliography I worked on for a paper I wrote recently. So here's the bibliography, or at least a little sample of it here, and it's in a Word document and it's in annotation mode. I know annotation mode's probably not for everyone. Here, let's turn some of these off so it's a little less convoluted here, and it's a little bit more straightforward to see. But you can see, first off, it's alphabetized, go figure, but alphabetized by author's last name, the first author, lead author's last name. Some citation styles, not to go on too much of a tangent here, but they're, it's like the difference between, slight differences. APA uses like a comma where Chicago style might use a period, or italics where another one might use quotes. It's not, I think when a lot of people think of citation styles, they think of them as like, oh, learning Greek versus Spanish. They're really not that different. It's just an aesthetically different way of formatting the metadata. Ultimately, they're all going to convey a lot of the same information, some differently than others. So I'm not really here to talk about one particular citation style. In this one, I'm using a Chicago style, but you might be using APA or MLA. That's not really what I'm here to talk about. So other things to note, you see authors are first and foremost. That's always one of the first things you're going to see in a citation is who are the authors of this text. If you're using like APA or whatever, they might just give you the first initial of that author's name, so you don't know what their first name is. Big whoop. Those are like those differences between the two, but their last names are going to be included. And then the next big thing that's always highlighted is the year of publication. So a general rule of thumb that I always do, and this is sort of when you can evaluate your sources, is if you don't know who the authors are and you don't know the year it was published, that's a big old red flag that you probably shouldn't be citing the source, because you have no idea who wrote it and when it was written. So what kind of authority does this source have to convey information that you're going to use in your text, right? And I see this all the time with students. They'll cite a web link and it'll have no author and it'll have no publication year. And it's like, well, what makes this web link authoritative in what you're talking about? So in this case, I could literally look up something about Gadi Herzlinger or Lior Grossman and probably figure out, what institution are they at? What's their affiliation? What's their job? Are they a journalist? Are they an academic? What department do they work in if they're an academic? Go from there. And I can start to evaluate the quality of the authors of this source, right? So those are two big important things, at least in my criteria. Sometimes it's unavoidable because there was no date. Like if you're working with historic primary sources or something like that, you sometimes end up with no date. You just have like a note and you have a rough date on it, but it was never dated when the person originally wrote this note, like in a notebook or a diary or something, and it doesn't have a date, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, if you're talking about like research or something that's trying to be an authoritative source on something, hopefully it has a date on it. And then you'll notice the next thing that's usually indicated is the title. So what's the name of the thing that you're citing? We've got a few different examples here. In at least one case, I've cited a book. So I have the entire book's title in there, and it's in italics again. Difference of different citation styles there. So not really something to worry about. And then you need to know what's the larger work that it's coming from. In this case, it's a journal. So this is just one article in a journal. This is the entire book, so this is the larger work. So really the larger work in that sense would be the publisher, because the publisher publishes more than just one book, right? In the case of PLOS ONE, they publish more than just this one article, so you need to reference them as the larger work. A newspaper publishes more than just one journalist's article, right? So you've got the smaller work, then you got the larger work, and then sometimes you have web links. So you're like, hold on, you've got what's going on right here? This isn't just an ordinary web link to some page. It's actually what we would call as a DOI, which is short for Digital Object Identifier. Essentially, this is like the digital equivalent of an International Serial Bus Number, ISBN. So when you're holding a book, well, I could pull a book off my bookshelf, but you've seen an ISBN before. It's the number that's given to each individual book so that we have a unique identifier for every printed book. But some things don't have print copies. So in this case, this citation, this source only exists on the internet. It has no physical media equivalent. And so you need a digital object identifier to represent that. And that's what looks like a web link is emblematic of. What about dictionaries? Good old dictionaries or encyclopedias. While those are good starting points for a lot of things, and this is probably, beating a dead horse for a lot of people out there, the thing with dictionaries and encyclopedias, they're not going to have an author usually, because it's, you have an entire staff who works in a dictionary. You've got hundreds of people usually that compile a dictionary, between editors, people who generate the definitions, and they're constantly updating them. So they're trying to stay abreast of what's going on, which inherently means they're not cutting edge. Like the latest dictionary is inherently going to be outdated in a few years. The latest encyclopedia is going to be constantly updated and need updating. So when you go to Wikipedia, you want to look at that bibliography and look at the years of publications that they're citing in this Wikipedia article. Digression, somewhat, but it's related to my Wikipedia comments. I just wanted to illustrate with this specific Wikipedia page on chiefdoms, it provides a good general overview of things, but let's go to the meat and potatoes. Let's go to that bibliography and check out and compare what we just talked about in my example with something that I cited for a book, or rather a journal article, Compare that to Wikipedia's bibliography. We've got 9 different sources here, and then we've got references, which can be a little bit more confusing because the bibliography and the references in Wikipedia sometimes doesn't necessarily make sense, but the references in some cases you can actually go to, and you can see there's the ISBN for these specific books. But we can see we've got a book from 2010, we've got a book from 1976, 63, 76, 2004, 2011. So we're getting a mix of stuff from different years, so it's not all from an old time period, right? So I can tell from this bibliography right away, I can say, oh, well, it's got a diverse age range of information, which tells me this isn't biased historically. Like if this is what people thought in the 60s, well, 60 years has passed since then. What are people saying in the intervening 60 years, right? But we do have authors that are publishing stuff a little bit more recently within the last decade. It looks like the most recent one being 2011. So still not the most cutting edge because, a lot has happened in the last decade. Probably people have written about chiefdoms and that could be incorporated in this wiki page. So it's not going to give you the most current information, but it's certainly going to give you at least generally the most up-to-date stuff. And then we can also look at the authors. We could, I'm just going to give you the broad brushstrokes here. Marshall Solins is a very famous anthropologist. So is Elman Service. So is Morton Freed. Timothy Pawcatat, very famous archaeologist. So they're getting some big names in here. So these aren't like nobodies that are writing on this. They're authoritative authors on the subject. So this bibliography has, some weight to it. So Wikipedia can be a good general source, but then you always want to look at the bones, right? You want to look at that bibliography and say, where are they getting their information from? Some wiki pages, it's just news articles. So you have to wonder, is this the most up-to-date, current, or authoritative source on a particular subject? But now let's take an example from something a little bit more, I guess, casual. I pulled a issue of, oh boy, The Glare is Real. The Glare is Real, Under London. This is an issue of National Geographic. I know my color is, I changed the hue on it because I was a little too yellow under the lights that I have on now. So this, you'll just have to take my word, it looks like a National Geographic. And when you flip to the main article on this one, you've got a lot of pretty pictures, and then you've got, keep flipping, pretty maps and whatnot. And then you get to the end, and then this is all you get, as it's all washed out here, and you can't see. But all you get, so I've got the year, I've got the author, so it's at least somewhat reputable in that sense. But there's no bibliography in here, so that raises a red flag for me of, well, they're not citing any sources, which tells me this is probably not geared towards an academic audience, someone who's professional, someone who's going to be critical of this. It's more for a general audience. And when we look at who owns National Geographic, it's owned by Disney now. So it's for entertainment purposes. National Geographic, the magazine. Whereas if we look at, say, American Antiquity from January 2004, obviously it's geared towards an academic audience. And then I flip through here and I've got multiple pages of bibliography to work with. And we're talking, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of bibliography. So here is an example of probably a better source to work with than, say, National Geographic, where the end goal of National Geographic is to entertain, whereas when we read the description of Sapiens, an online digital open access magazine, similar to National Geographic in its content and coverage, but the difference is who the authors are. So we can read the description right here where it says, an editorially independent magazine of the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, published in partnership with the University of Chicago Press. Okay, just from that alone and that descriptor of what is Sapiens, I can probably say most of the articles coming out of this source probably have a little bit more credence. And if I scroll up and I go to some of the authors, let's see here, let's just pick, well, we've got op-eds, we've got identities unearthed. Let's check this out. Okay, so we got a science journalist from Chicago, Illinois. Who do we have here? Professor of Archaeology Theory and Method at the University of Liverpool. So immediately, second article I picked is by a professor at Liverpool. So the point being, that just because they don't have bibliographies, because I think, actually, let's go back to this one. Just because there's nothing in the bibliography, like there's no bibliography here, doesn't mean that the source itself isn't authoritative or useful in of itself. And it's going to have a little bit more weight to it than, say, a Wikipedia page or a National Geographic article. So those are just a few examples that I wanted to go over. And all of that we would call metadata. So it's data about data. When we look at the citations, we're not really looking for, I mean, at least in my own opinion, I'm not looking for the aesthetic differences of periods versus commas versus italics and whatnot. What I'm looking for is metadata, because when I have to read, 50 student papers, that bibliography can tell me a whole lot instantly. If I have a bibliography and it's got 3 sources on it and you're writing 3 pages, that's 1 source per page. You're not going to get a lot of detailed information in 3 sources in your bibliography. Whereas, as I just illustrated here, these are like 2,000 word, anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 words, and they've got 5 pages of citations. Just this page alone is probably a lot for a lot of students. But just to give you the context of the level of citations that go into a lot of academic literature, because they're showing receipts, they're also showing a resume of, here's where I got all my information, here's where it's coming from in terms of years, in terms of authorship, and so you can learn a lot just by looking at the bibliography. If someone were to submit something to American Antiquity and only have 1/4 of 1 page of the citations, the editor might send it back and say, hey, you didn't do enough homework here, you don't have enough citations cited, you might be plagiarizing a lot of stuff here. And so that's one of the most important things about bibliographies, is they allow us to sort of evaluate very quickly the quality of the paper we're about to read before we even read the paper. I can learn a lot about a paper before I even read it just from what's in the bibliography. And hopefully you can take that knowledge and use it as well. And that's really why I wanted to do this video, is to really drive home why bibliographies matter and why professors are so obsessed with them. So hopefully you got something out of this video. If not, thanks for watching all the way to the end, and tune in for the next one. And until then, never stop learning.